Right, let's just dive right into it. Imagine, for a second, a single newspaper article sparking a revolution that literally changes the course of a nation's history. Well, on January 7, 1978, the Iranian daily newspaper Atalat published this piece titled Iran and Red and Black Colonization. And it made this wild claim that conservative religious leaders were secretly teaming up with communists to overthrow the royal ruler of Iran. It was a completely implausible argument, and frankly, it's widely understood to have been ordered by the Shah himself. But crazy enough, this very publication ignited the first stages of the Iranian Revolution. So welcome to this explainer, where we are going to unpack exactly how we got to that explosive moment.
The paradox of the last Shah. That's the crucial point we are going to explore today. The man at the absolute center of it all, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. Because his reign was defined by this massive, glaring contradiction. He was the ultimate paradox. He was, at the exact same time, this fierce modernizer trying to thrust his country into the future and an absolute dictator just desperately clinging to control.
But to really get how he eventually lost his throne, we kind of have to understand where he came from. Muhammad was born in 1919, entering a country that was just ravaged by disease and a devastating famine that killed around 2 million people. It was a time of deep political turmoil. His father, Reza Khan, actually seized power in a 1921 military coup, eventually crowning himself Shah. But Muhammad's upbringing, it was surprisingly global. His father sent him off to a Swiss boarding school when he was nearly 12, and it was there that he developed this deep, lifelong love for French culture and picked up multiple European languages. That teenage experience in Europe deeply influenced his intense drive to westernize Iran later in life.
His path to the throne, though, wasn't some peaceful, grand transition. It was completely forced by global conflict. In August 1941, right in the middle of World War II, the British and Soviets literally invaded Iran to secure its massive oil reserves and supply lines against Nazi Germany. Just weeks later, in September, they forced Muhammad's father to abdicate. So suddenly, at just 21 years old, Muhammad becomes the Shah. But, well, actually, he wasn't really in charge. By November 1943, he's hosting the big three Allied leaders, Churchill, Stalin, and Roosevelt, in Tehran, but at that point, he was essentially just a ceremonial puppet ruler in a militarily occupied country, while the British and Soviet ambassadors were the ones really pulling the strings.
Once the war ended and he finally got some real independence, the Shah woke up to a pretty daunting reality. Iran was almost impossible to rule uniformly. It wasn't just one monolith, it was this incredibly complex patchwork. You had secular liberals who were all about westernization, but really chafed under his eventual censorship. Then you had conservative Shia clerics, led by figures like Ayatollah Khomeini, who fiercely opposed all those secular reforms. Add to that a whole mix of ethnic minorities like the Baloch, Azeris, and Kurds, who often leaned heavily toward regional separatism. Trying to balance these deeply divided factions, that would turn out to be the greatest challenge of his life.
And that challenge completely exploded in the early 1950s. The Abadan crisis saw Iran's Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, go ahead and nationalize the British-controlled oil industry. The West totally panicked, fearing Soviet influence, so in August 1953, a Western-backed coup is launched. The Shah actually got terrified and fled to Rome, literally hanging out in nightclubs while the chaos unfolded back home. His quick exit severely damaged his reputation, but hey, the coup succeeded, and he returned with his absolute power restored. But he was terrified of future dissent now, so in 1957, he created SAVAK, a secretive and notoriously brutal secret police force. For the next 2 decades, this sprawling organization used censorship, illegal detention, and straight-up torture to ruthlessly crush any political opposition.
The White Revolution, modernizing Iran. So with his power locked down by SAVAK, the Shah decides it's time to radically reshape his country. Launched in 1963, the White Revolution was this sweeping modernization program aimed at breaking down Iran's traditional, centuries-old social hierarchies. And the scope was just staggering. He took massive estates away from the traditional aristocracy and powerful Shia clerics and redistributed all that land to farmers and the lower middle class. He granted women the right to vote. He set up a health corps of about 4,500 groups to bring medical care out to rural areas, and he poured oil wealth into these massive infrastructure projects. These were profound social changes that genuinely modernized the nation. But, and this is absolutely crucial, by stripping away the clerics' land and pushing a secular Western agenda, he deeply and perhaps fatally alienated Iran's conservative religious establishment.
Despite all that pushback, though, the immediate results, they were undeniable. Just look at the dramatic shift in education. Back in the 1950s, a mere 15% of Iranians could read and write. But thanks to the massive investments driven by the White Revolution, literacy in Iran skyrocketed to nearly 50% by the end of the 1970s.
It was this massive educational leap forward that empowered millions of people.
And the economy was roaring right alongside it. We were talking about a staggering 10% average annual GDP growth rate throughout the 1960s and 70s. A massive chunk of this was fueled by the 1973 oil crisis, which quadrupled the price of a barrel of oil in just 6 months. But give the Shah some credit here. He didn't just sit on that cash. His government intelligently reinvested those immense profits into new domestic industries, stuff like petrochemicals, textiles, cement, even cash crops. Living standards in the cities jumped, and it gave rise to this affluent, Western-leaning middle class that watched Western movies and dressed like they lived in Paris or Rome. It was a dizzying pace of modernization that left traditionalists feeling completely alienated in their own country.
But as we know, prosperity couldn't buy everyone's loyalty. Remember those conservative clerics? Well, their fierce opposition found a voice in a senior cleric named Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. Khomeini publicly compared the Shah to Caliph Yazid. If you don't know, Yazid was a highly divisive 7th century ruler who famously split the early Muslim world. So Khomeini was basically calling the Shah a divisive, completely illegitimate ruler tearing the country apart. This naturally sparked deadly riots in 1963, where hundreds were killed. The Shah, completely unwilling to tolerate this, had Khomeini arrested and ultimately exiled to Iraq in November 1964. And Khomeini, he would spend the next 13 years right across the border, just waiting.
Hubris and growing opposition.
Now this brings us to a really fascinating turning point. Unprecedented oil wealth mixed with unchallenged power? That's a dangerous combo. As the 1970s rolled on, the Shah's ego began to wildly inflate, and it created this massive, dangerous disconnect between the royal court and the daily reality of the Iranian people. Get this, in 1971 he threw an impossibly lavish, week-long celebration to mark the 2500th anniversary of the Persian Empire. They erected a massive tent city right at the ancient ruins of Persepolis, inviting global heads of state and royalty. The irony here? The historical math didn't even really add up. Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon in 539 BC, so the party was about a decade late. But historical accuracy wasn't the point, right? It was purely a glittering display of his own perceived absolute majesty, while completely ignoring the brewing tensions back home.
This total detachment led to a series of fatal missteps in the mid-1970s. First, he starts adopting these incredibly grandiose titles, officially declaring himself Shahanshah, or King of Kings. Then, in 1975, he shocked everyone by declaring Iran a one-party state, forcing all politics under his new Rastakhiz, or Resurrection Party. Meanwhile, rampant corruption was funneling literally billions of dollars of oil revenue directly into the hands of the royal court and the elites. And ordinary Iranians, they were getting absolutely crushed by severe economic mismanagement that triggered a brutal 15% annual inflation rate. These actions ended up doing the impossible. They united the left-wing secular liberals and the ultra-conservative religious clerics into a single, unified opposition against his regime.
Revolution and complex legacy.
So, we are heading right back to where we started, the beginning of 1978, where the pressure cooker of Iranian society finally violently bursts. Remember that bizarre Etalat article from January 1978 claiming the clerics and communists were conspiring? That was the spark. Protests erupted everywhere. Then, in August 1978, absolute tragedy struck. The Cinema Rex fire killed an estimated 450 people, completely outraging the public and acting as a massive turning point. Despite the Shah's desperate attempts to backtrack at that point, the momentum was completely gone. By December 1978, upwards of 10 million people were flooding the streets in mass rallies. The general started talking to the opposition. Finally, on January 16, 1979, the King of Kings flew out of Iran forever, paving the way for Ayatollah Khomeini to return in triumph just 2 weeks later.
But here is a wildly surprising fact that kind of completely changes how you view his final chaotic months in power. For years, the Shah had been fighting a deeply guarded secret battle with chronic lymphocytic leukemia. He'd actually been sick since 1974. So, when he embarked on that frantic, desperate exile, bouncing from Egypt to Morocco, Panama, Mexico, and eventually the US for treatment, he wasn't just a deposed king running from a revolution. He was a terminally ill man. The cancer ultimately claimed his life in Cairo in July 1980 at just 60 years of age. As for the country he left behind, it was immediately plunged into a completely new era of turmoil. Just months after he fled, the U.S. Embassy hostage crisis began in November 1979, resulting in hostages being held for nearly 15 months and permanently destroying relations with the West. The new Islamic Republic then faced a brutal 8-year war with Saddam Hussein's Iraq, and internally,
Well, the exact same societal frictions the Shah failed to manage never actually went away. From protests in 2009 all the way up to recent resistance in 2023 and 2026, the new religious regime has faced intense, periodic mass demonstrations from its very own citizens.
So, how do we ultimately make sense of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi? We're brought right back to the core contradiction of his rule. On one hand, you have the modernizing reformer, a guy who oversaw surging literacy, massive GDP growth, pushed for women's suffrage, and built robust diplomatic ties. But then you look at the other side, the corrupt authoritarian, the man who unleashed the brutal SAVAK secret police, aggressively censored the press, outlawed political opposition to create a one-party state, and oversaw rampant financial corruption.
Ultimately, both of these vastly different realities existed at the exact same time. It's a true historical paradox, which leaves us with this final, incredibly complex question. Was the last Shah of Iran a visionary liberal ruler genuinely building a modern, secular nation before being overthrown? Or was he a deeply corrupt authoritarian whose hubris and severe abuse of power directly caused his own catastrophic downfall? I'll leave it to you to weigh the scales of history. Thank you for joining me for this explainer, and as always, keep questioning the narrative.